Imagine for a moment, you've just tried to recall a specific detail from, say, a really long document. Or maybe it's a phone number buried deep in an email thread. Or, that crucial fact someone mentioned during a long meeting. You know the information is there, right? Somewhere. In your memory, maybe in your notes. But actually finding it and using it precisely right then and there, that's the real challenge. It's a core skill for us humans, obviously. But it turns out that even for the most advanced AI language models, it's surprisingly tricky. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into some really fascinating new research. It unravels this critical skill gap between two major types of large language models. On one hand, you've got the ones you probably know, transformers like the GPT series or Llama. And on the other, these newer, highly efficient models called state space models or SSMs. Think Mamba, for instance. Our focus today is this really groundbreaking paper. It's titled Understanding the Skill Gap in Recurrent Language Models, the Role of the Gather-and-Aggregate Mechanism by Aviv, Bick, and colleagues. Think of it like, I don't know, a detective story. We're trying to uncover the hidden mechanics behind how AI remembers or sometimes doesn't remember. So our mission today, we're going to explore why some of these models struggle with what the paper calls precise in-context retrieval. That's the crucial ability, right? To quickly pull out specific bits of information from stuff they've just processed. And here's where the mystery really deepens. The researchers suggest this entire skill gap might just boil down to how a tiny number, like just a few specialized components inside these huge models, actually work. We're going to unpack this, basically following the structure of discovery in the paper itself, tracing the clues step by step that led them to this pretty surprising revelation. Okay, let's unpack this then. Before we dive into the core mechanism they found, let's just make sure we're all clear on the main characters here. Transformers and state space models. So first up, transformers. They're kind of the dominant architecture right now, right? In large language models, think GPT-3, GPT-4, the Llama series, like Llama 3.18b, which features heavily in this paper. Their superpower is this technique called self-attention.
Right, self-attention. It's like this incredibly efficient internal cross-referencing system. It lets the model weigh the importance of every single token, basically, words or parts of words, against every other token in the input. And it does this all at once, in parallel.
Which means they can access all the past information directly. That's why they perform so well in complex tasks.
Exactly. But there's a catch, a big one. That parallel processing power, it comes at a cost, a computational cost that scales quadratically with the length of the input sequence.
Meaning for really long documents or conversations, they just get incredibly expensive, resource hungry, very, very fast.
Yeah, it's like having a perfect photographic memory, but the energy it takes to access it grows exponentially the more you try to remember.
Okay, so that's transformers.
Yeah.
Then on the other side, we have state space models, SSMs, like Mamba 1 and Mamba 2. These are the newer contenders, and they offer this really compelling alternative because they scale linearly with sequence length.
Which is a huge win, massive, for handling really long context, think whole books, maybe hours of dialogue. And they manage this linear scaling through what's called a fixed-size recurrent state.
Okay, what does that mean exactly? A fixed size recurrent state.
You can kind of picture it like a memory buffer that's constantly being updated. New information comes in, but to make room, older details get sort of compressed, maybe even blurred together. It maintains efficiency, but there's a trade-off. And that trade-off is fascinating because while the linear scaling is great, that fixed-size state creates a very specific challenge. The research paper notes that SSMs, quote, often struggle with the skill of in-context retrieval. That ability to precisely locate and pull out specific tokens, specific pieces of information that were presented much earlier in the sequence.
Ah, okay. So it's not just a minor glitch.
No, not at all. The paper calls it a fundamental algorithmic challenge. It's different from just general world knowledge. It's the difference between, say, knowing the capital of France versus remembering the specific phone number someone mentioned 5 paragraphs ago in that email you just read.
Right, and there's a key benchmark that really highlights this difference, isn't there? MMLU.
MMLU, yeah. Massive multitask language understanding. Traditionally, people saw MMLU mostly as a test of a model's general knowledge about the world.
But here's the twist the paper brings out. Its multiple choice format, pick A, B, C, or D, actually creates what they call a dual challenge.
Exactly. It's not just about knowing the fact. The model also needs the ability to precisely retrieve the correct letter label, A, B, C, or D, from the way the question is presented in the input context.
So that sets up the core tension the paper dives into. Is the performance gap we see on MMLU really about knowledge, or is it more about the specific targeted retrieval skill?
Precisely, and that's the question they set out to answer.
Okay, so how did they actually crack this? What did they find?
Well, the paper's central discovery is this mechanism they named the Gather-and-Aggregate mechanism, or G&A for short. And the key thing is, it's a unified two-stage process that both Transformers and SSMs seem to use for this in-context retrieval task.
Both use it. Okay, so it's the linchpin, the kind of secret sauce for accurate recall in both types of models.
Pretty much. It breaks down into two parts.
Right, the first stage involves what they call the gather head. What does that do?
Its job is basically to identify and condense meaningful segments within the input. So think of those multiple choice answers in MLU. The Gather Head finds the segment, reads through it, and then sort of summarizes it, condenses it down into a single representative token.
Like a quick summary tag for that chunk of text.
Exactly, like a little mental note. In Transformers, they show how this often happens when the token at the very end of a segment, like a new line character, maybe effectively looks back or attends to all the tokens in that segment and creates that summary.
The paper has a diagram showing this for Llama 3.18b, right? Like a focus beam picking out the answer choice.
Yeah, Figure 1a illustrates that quite nicely for a specific head, L16H22.
Okay, so that's the gather head, summarizing segments. What's the second stage?
The second stage involves the Aggregate Head. This happens usually in a subsequent layer. Its job is to retrieve and combine these summaries to inform the model's prediction.
So it takes those summary tags created by the gather head.
Right. When the model needs to make a decision, like outputting the final answer A, B, C, or D, the Aggregate Head looks at all the summary tokens representing the different choices. It then assigns higher importance, higher weights, to the most relevant summary token. Effectively, it picks the best summary.
Almost like an internal argmax operation, picking the maximum or best fit.
You can think of it that way, yeah. It selects the most appropriate summary from the options the gather heads presented. Figure 1b shows this for another head in Llama, L17H24.
Okay, this raises a really important question then. If both Transformers and SSMs are using this gather and aggregate mechanism, why the performance gap? Why do Transformers generally do better on tasks like MMLU?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's the study's big insight. They argue that, quote, their retrieval gap reduces to the effectiveness with which a few specific heads implement the G&A mechanism.
So it's not whether they have the mechanism, but how well a few specific parts actually execute it. The precision matters.
Exactly. It's about the quality of implementation in those few critical components. That was the first major clue.
So how did they actually pinpoint this? The methodology here sounds pretty clever, like detective work.
It really was. Their first big experiment involved something called layer pruning. They took several models, Llama 3.18b, a transformer, Falcon Mama 7b, an early SSM, and Llama 8b, an SSM distilled from Llama. And they started removing layers, one by one, from the end of the network, working backwards.
Okay, peeling the onion layer by layer. What happened?
Something really surprising. Performance on general knowledge tasks. That declined gradually, smoothly, as you'd expect when removing parts of the model.
Makes sense.
But MMLU performance was totally different. It stayed remarkably stable, almost flat, until they removed one specific layer. And at that point, MMLU accuracy just plummeted, dropped sharply.
Wow. So that pointed right at a crucial layer, specifically for the skills MMLU tests.
Precisely. For Llama 3.18b, they identified layers 16 and 17 as being particularly critical for this.
That feels like a huge piece of evidence. Did they do anything else to confirm it wasn't just about knowledge?
They did. They created a pruned version of Llama 3.18b that had lost most of its general knowledge. It only retained about 30% of its original score on knowledge benchmarks.
Okay, so a significantly dumber model in terms of facts.
Right. But guess what? It still achieved 66% accuracy on MMLU.
No way. Even with most knowledge gone.
Yep. Which strongly suggested that MMLU's success wasn't primarily about knowing facts, but about this other skill, this precise retrieval ability linked to those specific layers. Solid evidence.
Okay, so they found the critical layers. What next? Did they look inside those layers?
Exactly. The next step was to zoom in even further, using head ablation. This meant going inside those crucial layers, like 16 and 17 in Llama, and disabling individual attention heads, one by one, to see the effect. The results were, frankly, remarkable. They found that MMLU performance depended on just a few mixing heads.
Just a few out of how many?
In a model like Llama 3.18b, there are thousands of heads. But disabling just one specific gather head, L16H22, or one specific aggregate head, L17H24.
Yeah, what happened?
MMLU accuracy crashed from 66% all the way down to 25%.
25%. That's just random guessing on a four-choice question.
Exactly. Random chance. We're talking about less than 0.1% of the model's total heads having that dramatic an impact on this specific skill.
Incredible. Like finding the one tiny screw that holds the whole machine together for that one function.
That's a good analogy. It really isolates the function to these very specific components.
Okay, but maybe MMLU is just weird. Did they try to isolate this retrieval thing even more directly?
They did. That led them to design a very focused experiment, the synthetic key-value retrieval task, or KV retrieval. The idea was super simple but elegant. Measure how well models could store and recall totally arbitrary pairs of information, like banana.17 or table right of 5.
Ah, so no natural language ambiguity, no reliance on world knowledge, just pure recall.
Precisely. Strip away all the confounding factors. Just, can you remember this specific thing I told you?
And what did the results show?
Unequivocally the same thing. Removing those specific gather or aggregate heads they'd identified earlier, it significantly tanked performance on this pure retrieval task too. And interestingly, the negative impact of removing the aggregate head got worse as the number of key value pairs, the dictionary size, increased.
Which makes sense if its job is to pick the one correct item from a larger set.
Exactly. It was basically the final nail in the coffin. Undeniable proof that these specific G&A heads were central to the mechanism of in-context retrieval. The detective had found the culprits and understood their method.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. The payoff. We know the G&A mechanism is vital. It's concentrated in a few heads, and both model types use it. So, let's get to the core difference. How do transformers and SSMs actually implement it differently? And why do SSMs seem to struggle more with that precise retrieval?
Right. This is where the architectural differences really manifest. The research points to fundamental SSM limitations in G&A implementation. Remember how transformer attention can be really sharp. It can pinpoint one specific token, give it a very high weight, and ignore others.
Yeah, they're sharp, localized patterns.
SSMs, because of their recurrent state mechanism, tend to exhibit what the paper calls smoother behavior. Their internal attention, though it works differently, is less focused, more spread out.
Smoother, meaning less precise.
Effectively, yes. This softness, as they put it, limits their ability to isolate segments cleanly, so their gather heads might leak attention outside the exact boundaries of, say, an answer choice, pulling in a bit of the surrounding text.
Which would muddy the summary.
Exactly. And similarly, their aggregate heads struggle to sharply focus on the correct summary token. They have a harder time picking out the single best option with the same crispness as a transformer's attention head.
Okay, so this smoother, less precise behavior, does that explain anything else?
It leads directly to what the paper observed as redundancy in SSMs, because the individual SSM components involved in G&A are less expressive or less powerful on their own.
They need more of them to do the same job.
Precisely. They compensate by using more heads. The paper shows this clearly. They created minimal versions of models. A pruned transformer, Llama 3.1 minimal, needed just one aggregate head to get 98% of its MMLU score. But Llama 8B minimal, the SSM, needed two aggregate heads to get 95% of its score.
Two instead of one.
And Falcon Mamba 7B minimal, an older Mamba 1-based SSM, needed four aggregate heads just to reach 86% of its potential MMLU score.
Wow, 4 heads doing the work of one transformer head, roughly.
It strongly suggests that where one sharp tool, a transformer head, suffices, you need several less sharp tools, SSM components, to approximate the same result.
And the underlying reason for this smoothness, this need for redundancy, goes back to...
It goes back to that fixed size recurrent state.
Yeah.
That core mechanism that makes SSMs efficient also, inherently, blurs boundary distinctions because it's always compressing the past information stream.
So the key takeaway isn't that SSMs are just broadly worse. It's a very specific, targeted, algorithmic limit in how effectively they implement these particular G&A heads because of their core architecture.
Exactly. It's a localized issue, not a global failing. Which is actually good news, because if you know where the problem is...
You can try to fix it, which leads to...
hybrid models.
Ah, the best of both worlds approach.
Potentially, yes. The idea is quite elegant. Take a mostly SSM-based architecture for that efficiency with long contexts, but strategically insert a few attention layers, specifically where they can do the most good.
And the research suggests these hybrid models naturally figure out where to use that attention.
It seems so. They found that these models naturally delegate aggregate head functionality to attention layers.
What?
Because attention, with its ability to create those sharp focus patterns, is simply better suited for aggregation. It's the right tool for that specific part of the GNA job, picking the one best summary.
Like using a scalpel for surgery instead of, I don't know, a butter knife?
That's a perfect analogy. Attention provides the needed precision right where it counts for retrieval.
Do they have proof this works in practice, in actual hybrid models?
They do. They looked at Zamba 27B, a hybrid model. They found specific attention heads crucial for MMLU. Disabling just 9 of these critical attention heads caused MMLU accuracy to drop significantly from about 64% down to 35%.